So, welcome to week 2 of Braving the Wilderness. Uh, Thank you for all those who have dropped where you're joining us from in the chat. Hello from Alabama. All right. So, let's talk loneliness. Brené Brown in our book talks a lot about loneliness. Chapter 3 is all about this, and I realized as I was reading through it and making notes, I think we have a lot to say on this topic. The Big Sort. So I don't know, is Bill Bishop is either The Big Sort or Bowling Alone? Have y'all heard of those books and or the research that has come out of it before getting to this? I'm just curious how far his research has kind of permeated. So let me know in the chat. No, some yes. Okay. So before writing The Big Sort, he wrote Bowling Alone. And I don't have the years on this. So Bowling Alone, he's talking about how our social groups have broken down. And we no longer have these groups that put us together across our differences. And the main example he uses is one of seminary professors often referred to Bowling Alone, is the bowling league. We don't have bowling leagues anymore. And bowling leagues are where the guys or the girls would get together. And it didn't matter what church you belonged to or what organization, you got together to bowl and you had a good time. And you might have cross conversations, but the reality was you got to know people who were different from you. And as bowling leagues and all of these social groups that used to happen in the 50s, 60s, 70s, as they began to disintegrate, we started sorting ourselves more and more and more, which leads us into the big sort. And this is all great research. The beautiful nature of Google is you can hop on and just say, give me the full excerpt, or what's the overview of these things. So in the big sort, he's talking about how like-minded, homogenous groups squelch dissent. And they grow more extreme in their thinking and ignore evidence that their positions are wrong. As a result, we now live in a giant feedback loop, hearing our own thoughts about what's right and wrong bounced back to us by the television shows we watch, the newspapers and books we read, the blogs we visit online, the sermons we hear, and the neighborhoods we live in. So we're in these echo chambers. And what's interesting, so The Big Sort was written in 2009. The book that we're reading came out in 2000, I think 17, maybe. It references a lot in 16. So yeah, 2017. We're a number of years past these things. And I think if we talk to Bill Bishop and to Brené Brown re-referencing all of this material, we would see that these gaps, the ways that we've sorted, have only grown more and more distinct. And I would, as I was reading this, and maybe you had the same thought, I would just love to know how she would rewrite this, framing COVID in the middle, because that's that huge monkey wrench that happened in the middle of all of this. So we can talk about that as we keep going. So thinking about this, the sorting that we do to ourselves and to one another is at best unintentional and reflexive. At worst, it's stereotyping and dehumanizing. So we sort naturally. We look at someone, we see how they're dressed. Maybe they're wearing very flowy clothes in earth tones of browns and greens and muted blues, and they have Birkenstocks on their feet and long flowing hair. Well, we might sort that person and say, okay, well, maybe this person loves the earth and is working to combat climate change. We might see someone in combat boots and ripped jeans, and it happens all the time to Black men in hoodies. We sort based on these characteristics, and at best, it's unintentional and reflexive. At worst, it's stereotyping and dehumanizes. And we saw that again and again and again with all of these shootings, simply by what people look like, a Black man in a hoodie, and that shouldn't be. So family is the one group that most of us choose to negotiate rather than sort out of our lives. I would be really interested to see how that has changed post January 6th, post COVID, because that shook a lot of things up. And I know of a lot of families that have chosen to sort out of each other's lives. But the hope is, and I've heard this same story as well, that families have come back together, even if they have had those times of breaking out. So I'm curious, how do you find this in your families? Are you willing to stay engaged in the long run with your families, not sorting based on differences, and stay present in those conversations? Or as I heard one person on Sunday say, we hold off on some of those conversations because we know it's just not going to be productive. So we come together in the places where it matters and leave the politics and religious conversation aside. Phyllis says, homogeneity was once upon a time a principle of church growth. I never accepted it, but do we ever see? Oh, we do see the big sort in congregational existence. But I also think, so we do see the big sort in congregations, but we also don't see it. I think it depends on the work of the church and what's really keeping them there. So I'm going to get on a soapbox for a minute, and I apologize. This is if a congregation has come together around an individual, be that the pastor or associate pastor or someone in the church, if they are focused around one individual, then they are going to sort based on that one individual. Now, if a congregation has come together because they are doing the work of Christ, and all these people for at least one or two generations have come together across differences, and they're committed to the church and to each other as people, they don't sort, even if the person in charge might want them to. And it's really fascinating to see this. We call them purple churches. Often you have the red side and the blue side that come together to make purple. And really our churches, our purple churches, are some of the last places where we are coming together these days. So you all are answering my question in the chat. So people stay away from differences. So family distance is great. So when they do come together, politics, that's not the function, the focus. Stubborn unity. Nancy, I think you may have just summed that all up. Stubborn unity. And I think that's what we have to be, because we need to be in these conversations. Joan, 100% agree. Congregations can't work around an individual clergy. Yes, they have to be in this community doing the work of God. So limited to blood family, okay, in the US. All right. Oh, I love that, Robin. Organizer of the 58th annual Family Crab Feast next week. Wow. That's really wonderful. So not talking politics. Oh, identity has been politicized. So only people that accept me. Thank you for your vulnerability, Megan. I really appreciate that. We don't sort as a family and are willing to have the conversations, but do it with civility and trust. So it's this mixed bag. And I'll say, it's really easy to see people as other, even if they're people you've loved your whole life. And there are lots of different reasons. So Megan, you provided a really good perspective there. I appreciate that. Okay, so here's the big thing. At the same time sorting is on the rise, so is loneliness. Ah, so if we go all the way back to bowling alone, the loss of these groups that brought us together across differences and gave us a common purpose to the big sort, as sorting is on the rise, and we saw it escalate during COVID, so is loneliness. And we've heard about this epidemic of loneliness. Elizabeth says, if the church builds community and works to make a difference in the community, we do not sort, we unite. Oh, yes. I belong to a primarily African American church and we impact community. Amen. And everything. Yeah, Amy Lou, it sounds like you and Megan might have some cons. So mixed bag, siblings have been together for funeral. Wow, Debbie. Oh, thanks for sharing. So here we are at loneliness. As members of a social species, we don't derive strength from our rugged individualism, but rather from our collective ability to plan, communicate, and work together. Our neural, hormonal, and genetic makeup support interdependence over independence. So this is Brené Brown is quoting neuroscience researcher John Cacioppo, I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, of the University of Chicago, looking at, so again, if we're thinking back to the survival of the species, we couldn't survive unless we were together. We needed people to hunt and to gather and to care for the children and to care for each other. So we had to have these communities and started forming communities very, very early. And so we've moved into this sense of isolation and being alone. When we feel isolated, disconnected, and lonely, we try to protect ourselves. This defense mechanism comes up. In that mode, we want to connect, but our brain is attempting to override connection with self-protection. So there's actually a phenomenon called lonely brain. You can Google it. I was trying to find, I didn't find kind of the perfect research to share with you, but if you Google lonely brain, you'll come up with a bunch of articles and you can just sort of skim a few of them and get the sense. So what happens when we go into lonely brain? And I looked at this during COVID just because we saw it happen so much. Our brains actually change. So there's less white matter, there's less gray matter. The way that we process things, it actually changes from individual to individual. Researchers found that if they tested people who were not lonely, who identified as not lonely, they would react to a certain set of stimuli in predictable ways. There were patterns in how they all reacted. So when they tested people who identified as lonely brain, as being lonely, they reacted in a multitude of different ways. It was based on the individual. So we can't say, oh, and when you have lonely brain, you do X, Y, and Z. It's really characterized by your own self, but we're not reacting the same way that we do if we are feeling connected and part of this larger group. So when we get lonely, we're actually our own worst enemies because we want to connect, but we're self-sabotaging. Let's see. So unchecked loneliness fuels continued loneliness by keeping us afraid to reach out. And you end up, one of the things that most of the research showed was you perceived slights differently. So if someone says something offhand, you might take it as, oh, well, they really don't want me here, so I'm going to check out. Rather than if you don't have lonely brain, then you just say, oh, well, that's just a thing. So it is this self-perpetuating cycle, and it's just fascinating. Before we go to that, thinking about how do we overcome this? There's like, oh, go make more friends. Well, hello. How hard is it to make friends? It's really hard. And I'm pretty sure the older you get, the harder it is to make friends. Um, People with kids have kind of built in, like, oh, you have a child my same age, let's be friends. And that happens. Uh, but what happens when you don't have that? How do you make friends? Well, you come to church. That's a place to make friends. And I hope you all know, everyone on here, you are a part of this community and you belong. And one of the ways that we overcome this can be not necessarily by increasing the number of friends, but by strengthening the connections that you do have. So even in those regular text message check-ins, that's strengthening the connection. Joan shared being retired, you have to reach out, especially if you live alone. Yeah, for sure. It's a lot of work. Our Western society has set us up to be lonely. We used to live together in family units and community for most of history, and it's only very recently that we don't live in those ways. So interconnectedness in the Bible. And I want to hear, I have some thoughts, but this is not an exclusive list. So put in the chat, where does the Bible talk about how we are connected? Of course, the very first thing that came to mind is that we are the body of Christ and individually members of it, and we are all part of each other, and we need all of our differences. So that was the very first thing that came to mind. One bread and one body. So every Sunday, when we share the bread, whether we are able to physically take it in a local congregation or take it through spiritual communion, we are joining with Christians through all time and space, connected through that one body. Oh, in Matthew, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am the vine, you are the branches. That's right. Love one another as I have loved you. These are beautiful. I didn't want to go to the early church in Acts. Those of you who participated in our Acts Bible study, we talked a lot about this, how they came together as community and shared their resources. Now, eventually they started fracturing and having issues too, but there was some beautiful time in there. And that was the point, was to come together and to be together. Love your neighbor as yourself. Yes. And even from the beginning, when God created humankind, it is not good to be alone. Created, let's see here, sharing the thoughts of peace for unity, unity for peace, created by the same God in the image of God. When 2 or 3 are gathered, yes. Thank you. These are wonderful. I don't know that I had it. I think that may have been the last one. Jesus sent his disciples in twos, not just one. Yes. And we could just keep going. I mean, that's the beauty. We are created to be in communion with each other. We are not created to be individuals on our own. And this is kind of this overarching umbrella of spirituality. Spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. Amen. So this is Brené Brown's definition of spirituality, found on page 45 in the book. And I think it's really beautiful. And it is this spiritual sense that pulls us together. And as Christians, we say we recognize not only that we're connected, but we recognize the face of God in the other, and recognize that God loves all of us. No matter who, how, what, where, why, God loves all of us. So here's where I want us to spend some time reflecting. Our time. Okay. So when have you experienced loneliness? And when you were in that time, did you view the world differently? And if you have come out of that time, I recognize that not everyone may have come out of that time. What brought you out of that place? And how did COVID exacerbate our loneliness epidemic? I mean, clearly the obvious ways, but how can or have we moved out of it? So I'm curious. I'm looking at our time. I think we have. Actually, let's do this one in the chat and then we'll break up into small groups for the other ones. So if you're willing to share, have you actually, you know what? We don't even have to do this in the chat. Let's do this in a whole group. So raise your hand if you are willing or have something to share. And we're gonna try and keep what you say to just a couple of sentences. And we'll just spend a couple of minutes here reflecting together. Megan.
Yeah, I was going to tell a story about, in the middle of COVID, when we were all isolated, those of us who were like single and living alone were extra super double isolated. And at one point, a friend of mine and I, we literally went out into the woods and were hugging trees because we needed hugs.
Yeah.
So it sounded silly. It actually kind of worked.
It doesn't, I mean, it sounds silly, but it also doesn't sound silly. It sounds creative. Thank you. Mimi in the chat said, as a new mother. Yes, that's a very isolating time. Irma, would you like to share?
Yes, I wanted to say it was a very lonely year when my youngest sister stopped calling me, stopped being close to me, and I never even knew why. And turned out she had a hysterectomy, and I had asked and asked if she needed me to stay and help, and she kept saying no, that her daughter was going to be there. Well, it turned out that her daughter must not have been enough, but it was a very lonely time for me. And even though we've kind of sort of reconciled, I don't feel that our closeness is there anymore.
I'm so sorry. Thank you for sharing. Roxanne.
The loss of a spouse can bring on loneliness.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Thank you, Roxanne. Rebecca.
I moved to a new area only a couple of months before COVID started, and I hadn't had enough time to really meet. I had my daughter live nearby, but once COVID struck, that was kind of out. But I hadn't really had a time to meet very many people. And the saving grace was all the neighbors, especially the ones that had dogs to walk, of which I don't, but I'm a walker. We would holler to each other across the street or whatever and just say, well, my name is, or my dog's name is, and that was life-saving.
Yeah, thank you. We have a few in the chat. Another person was widowed. Mother was in a retirement home and not allowed to visit. Yeah. I'll just say this is even today. I when I'm not in DC, I work from home and I'm all by myself. So I love the Cathedral has a lot of meetings, and even though I don't love necessarily all the meetings, I do like to get on the meetings so that I could see people's faces, like Heather, who's smiling right there. But and I have a writing group, and sometimes I'm not even doing writing, I'm just working, and I'm like, I just wanted to be on here to see your faces, so I have people. Elizabeth, yeah.
I think it's really important to focus on how we combat the loneliness. So because I think, like Megan said, being single in today's world and everything in the work world is virtual. So many things are virtual. So many things are even our book club. Like sometimes I just wish I could like reach through the screen, right? Like you want to be present. So I think like the technology brought good and bad. Like for me, my church never stopped meeting during COVID. So I actually found a sense of purpose and community. So that's where I find it, is that when I'm lonely, I turn to God. That's just me. That's what I choose to do. But I also think things like Zoom and online meetings. For example, through one of the meetings, I think it was a cafe meeting at the Cathedral, I met somebody from Nigeria where we built a wonderful friendship. So like some of those things, they would have never happened during COVID. They would have never happened had COVID not happened, because I would never be in those spaces. So it's important to like take the good with the bad, right? Like, okay, this bad thing happened, but we also have this to react to, and we have different ways of building community, even though they're not the same.
Thank you. I'm going to read the chat and then we'll get to Jean and then we'll hop back on our big group. So divorce, it was hard to watch people being affectionate. Yeah, for sure. Still isolated because of a diagnosis at the end of COVID and keep getting secondary. Yeah, that is very isolating. So got over it having to dive through the surf to get to calm waters. Don't just sit there in the sometimes you have to power through. Deborah said, since I live in a rural area, had made so many connections that COVID felt manageable. Friends and family reaching out. Church did a good job of setting up Zoom times. That's lovely. All right. And closing us out for this question is Jean.
Hi. Well, I actually like being alone. So, so being lonely really doesn't affect me very much. But this year I had a house crisis. And when the house crisis happened, I felt alone. I felt loneliness for the first time because other people couldn't participate in the same way. I could get sympathy, but they weren't participating. It wasn't that kind of unity that happened. So it was just a curious time. And I'm glad to being back to being happy being alone.
Well, I don't know if you remember in the book, but Brené Brown actually says that when often if she's out in public and she says she has that lonely feeling, she calls her husband and says, I got that lonely feeling. He says, go to your room and be by yourself. And that's what gets rid of that lonely feeling. So lonely and alone are definitely two different things. And I love to be alone too, but I recognize I need a certain threshold of being with people and seeing faces and all of that. All right, so back to our screen share. Okay. I love the title of chapter 4. People are hard to hate, close up, move in. Easier said than done. So clinging to hate, and I loved this, the quote that started off the chapter. And she quotes James Baldwin, who says, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. And friends, there is so much pain out in the world. So I've been thinking about this zooming in and what a different picture we get. So this is a picture of a sunflower. And if we were zoomed out, we'd just say, oh, it's a lovely sunflower. But zoomed in like this, we can see the pattern of the spiral. We can see the gradients of the colors. We can see where it is close and tight together. And as it gets farther apart, there's so much more we can see when we're zoomed in. What came to mind, and I didn't create this image, is, if we're zoomed out, we might just see a bubble that says a category. So our most obvious categories right now, Republican and Democrat. I'm going to use that just for simplicity. We might see a bubble that says Republican. We might see another bubble that says Democrat. And that's what they look like zoomed out, these completely different bubbles. But as we zoom in and we start to see the individuals that make up these bubbles, we might see dog lover, cat lover. We might see person who likes to take walks. We might see singer or dancer, artist. So as we get closer, we can see the things that make us more similar. So Brené Brown says, it's not easy to hate people close up. And when we are in pain and fear, anger and hate are our go-to emotions. Almost everyone, and this is her speaking, I've ever interviewed or known will tell you that it's easier to be pissed off than it is to be hurt or scared. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a safe default to go to pissed off, and it's much less vulnerable than being hurt or scared, because those live here in the heart, and they feel very different in our bodies. When we're pissed off, there's this wall that protects us, whereas hurt and scared are tender and vulnerable. So thinking about anger as a catalyst. Sometimes owning our pain and bearing witness to struggle means getting angry. When we deny ourselves the right to be angry, we deny our pain. So that feeling right here. It's critical to recognize that maintaining any level of rage, anger, or contempt, that favorite concoction of a little anger and a little disgust, over a long period of time is not sustainable. Anger is a catalyst. So that led me to think, if you are Cathedral watchers, you may have seen the Reverend Canon Kelly Brown Douglas's sermon from a couple of weeks ago. I will link to it in the email that I send out this week. But she was, yeah, great timing. If you didn't watch it, it is so worth watching. If you did watch it, it's worth going back and reading the transcript. But she says, anger against injustice, against humanity and the inhumane treatment of others. Anger against that which you know to be wrong is not simply okay, it's required. If we are to live into the biblical story that we read, inviting us into God's vision for us all. And my goodness, Jesus certainly got angry. So yes, anger is not simply all right, it is required. But we can't stay in that anger. And that's kind of that key piece, is that when we stay in that anger, it begins to eat away at us instead of transforming us. Let's see. So let's talk about this transforming anger. How can we use anger as a catalyst in our lives and transform it into something life-giving? Courage, love, change, compassion, justice. And what makes you angry that needs transformation? And I am going to divide us into groups, because this is a good one to talk about. So spend a couple of minutes while I'm working on that to think about this and what your answers might be. All right. So we still need boundaries in the wilderness. We can't just go out there with our anger thinking we're going to transform things without boundaries. And boundaries are what protect us. They keep us safe. They set the distance between me and you and others around us, and help us to contain our sense of self without it spilling out and getting trampled on. So thinking, and this is something we've seen in our news cycles far too much over the last decade or so. So dehumanizing others is the process by which we become accepting of violations against human nature, the human spirit, and for many of us, violations against the central tenets of our faith. We are all vulnerable to the slow and insidious practice of dehumanizing. Therefore, we are all responsible for recognizing it and stopping it. And it's a great section in the book. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. She gives wonderful examples. And then here we are back to this transformation. And so she is using the research of Dr. Michelle Buck. And she actually lists, she gives the whole interview with her, and she is a clinical professor of leadership at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. And so talks about this by creatively navigating the conversational landscape of differences and disagreements, we have the opportunity to create something new. Conflict transformation is about creating deeper understanding. It requires perspective taking. As a result, it enables greater connection, whether or not there is agreement. And I love, she talks a lot about intention. And she talked about planning a family gathering. So Robin, when you posted that in the chat that you had a family gathering coming up, it made me think of that. You know, if two people are coming together to plan this family gathering, they have the same intention, even if they start having conflict of the how or the why or the when or things like that. And so by going back to that intention, what we find that commonality. Oh, and I missed some things in the chat. The portion sharing the interview with Dr. Buck is great. Yeah. The reproductive rights issues were being expanded in the late 60s and 70s, and those battles are fought again and again. Yes, yes, yes. So thank you, Janet. Focus on closer issues where we can make a difference and have an impact. I feel like I missed. All right, so one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I didn't put it in here, it's in this dehumanization. And I guess I was thinking about it with that second quote. We're vulnerable to the slow and insidious practice of dehumanization. And it's this erosion that happens. And it's that metaphor of the frog in the pot of cold water, that if you put a frog in a pot of cold water and turn on the heat, he's not going to notice it until it's too late. But if we are able to recognize as that temperature changes before it gets too late, before it gets to that boiling point. I remember learning about a study that was done, and this was looking at Nazi Germany. I learned this back in middle school, and it stuck with me. There was a school class that was learning about Nazi Germany, and they kept saying, oh, how could this happen? How could people, systematically dehumanize others? And so they set up an experiment in the classroom, and the teacher every week would pick a characteristic to laud and another characteristic to put down. And so one week it was those who had blue eyes got to go to the front of the line, and those who had brown eyes had to clean up the classroom behind everyone else. And as the weeks went on, as they continued this experiment, even as it changed, who was on top and who was on the bottom, the identification with the group and that was on top, and the dehumanization of the group that was on the bottom, and then everyone who was in the middle, they were all jockeying to get into that top group. And it was fascinating. I mean, these were like fourth graders who were belittling just because someone had brown eyes. And whatever it wasn't always this standard. I mean, they switched it up. So it was really fascinating. The movie that we watched was called The Wave. And it shows how easy it is to fall into this trap of dehumanization, especially when we are zoomed out into these large groups. So it is when we zoom in, that's when we can see the difference. Let's see here. We have a few things in the chat. We need for peace and unity is calm dialogue without angers and fears. Yeah, so I was reminded of the blue eyes versus brown eyes division created in the book cast. Okay, and Brené said in an interview, when someone uses slurs or dehumanizing talk, she reacts by saying, Jesus, that is not funny. Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, I mean, we have to. And our language creates reality, and we're not always aware of how our language does this, but the words that we use and the way that we use them actually do create the reality around us. And we see that, we're seeing that with the conventions that have happened and in the speeches that are given by our candidates. And when a word gets used and another group reclaims it, but then it gets twisted. And so I just, when I see those things show up on social media, it reminds me of this. And it's a slippery slope. Yes, it's important to reclaim the words that get used against us, but how do we do it without then flipping the narrative and dehumanizing those who use the words in the first place? Okay. So our last time of reflection. So have you ever practiced this conflict transformation? Whether you knew the skills or didn't know the skills, now that you've read about it, what changed in this process, or where do you see that this skill might be needed in your life today? I am going to stop our share so that we can talk about this conflict transformation and this change that we need. And we'll do this again in our large group. Megan said, I try to consciously avoid name calling to center people's humanity. You're not a racist. You're a human being that used a racist argument. Yes, I had someone point that out to me. I think it was a friend whose roommate I didn't like in college. And I'm like, oh, your roommate, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no. You can't just say your roommate. You have to call him by his name and then say whatever it was you were going to say to complain about him. And I think about that all the time, because even that level, that language change of putting a label on someone, even if it's as simple as your roommate versus, I don't even remember his name, Tom, saying Tom frustrated me, it changes how we have that conversation. So what sort of conflict transformation have you been a part of? Have you seen? Would you want to see? Any thoughts on that? This one is a little harder. We may not have worked with this in the past.
I mean, this is a topic, but I know on a personal level, all conflict resolution always starts with, I hear what you're saying. What I think you're saying is, or what I hear you say makes me feel like. And if you just personalize it and it's like what your friend said, you can't say your roommate. You can't say those people. You have to say, Joe Smith just said this to me and it makes me feel afraid, scared, vulnerable, whatever it is. And you have to open yourself up to why this thing makes you feel the way it makes you feel, which is always making you feel vulnerable, blah, 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 which is hard.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on transforming conflict?
This is Oriel.
Hey, Oriel.
Hi. I think that leadership is important. And I think when leaders continue to use slurs, call people names, and do all those things every day, then it gives others permission to do the same thing. And they were looking for an avenue to do that. And so then it becomes the norm. And you talked about seeing it on the web everywhere, people just become awful without that they're dehumanizing other people because one person is doing it, or several, or a group of people are doing it, and it becomes the norm. And so I don't know how you transform that, but I think it starts with leadership in any place. People always follow the leader and do things that they might not have done if they didn't feel that they had the permission to do it.
Thank you, Ariel. Amen. Jean.
Well, I have an example that is very, very painful. I am from a small church. Like, well, we're a big church, but we're half Latino and maybe a quarter English speaking. And the vestry, so we don't have much money, is what I'm saying. And money becomes a driving factor. Our church invited or accepted a lease with a Seventh-day Adventist church, which is totally against gays and seeks to convert them, to transform them. We have a significant gay population in our church. And so the hurt, that conflict came out in the church discussion. And what was unsatisfying about the whole thing was that even though there was a consensus and an understanding of the hurt, there was an autocratic response to it. We need the money, we're going to do it. And it left people very alienated and hurt. So I didn't think of one, and that really is an example of conflict that didn't really get resolved.
Right.
We did have one compromise. I will say that there was one, we decided to hang the rainbow flag.
That's
so
good.
as a statement of what we believe. But that it was different from what was wanted. Okay.
And perhaps people who had felt seen and felt like they belonged no longer felt that way.
Felt monetized.
Yeah. We had a few things in the chat. Let's see here. Solving potential conflicts and divisions leading to violence must be learning their living environment with difficulties. So telling doesn't help and might destroy humanity and dignity. So on a personal level, there was a contentious family divorce. Children in that marriage are getting married and so on, and the family is starting to come together again. Oh, that's beautiful. The family is starting to repair old wounds. That is really lovely and sadly not the norm. As someone who has seen a fair share of weddings, that is not the norm. Let's see here. Leaders, management voicing up to their wrongdoings and votings and elections without violences. Oh, I thank you for lifting this up, Phyllis. The idea to say, tell me more and listen, that is always a good response. If something, when you're in conversation and something triggers in you and you can feel it, we know when that happens, there's the seasoning inside of, that's not right. That hit me a funny place. So by simply taking a breath and saying, tell me more, it can help to get to that next layer underneath the intentions that help to transform this conflict.
And I was going to say, because Brené Brown even said it's hard when people are talking not to be thinking about what you want to say next. And I think it's a practice. So, I mean, I'm trained as a therapist, and I can tell you, I read these things and go, oh yeah, I should try to do that better. And I mean, it's something that I've been doing for 20 years, but it's different when somebody's sitting in an office and you're listening to them because that's your focus versus when you're listening to somebody who you think is just saying something stupid or who totally disagrees with you or who you have some investment in how they think or feel because of the organization you're in or something. So I always remember that yoga is a practice, you know, that some days you do it well and some days you don't. And I think everything they talked about, and I really like the idea of conflict transformation. And I just thought, but it's a practice. There's no way I'm going to do this perfectly every time. But then I think if you're paying attention to what you do, and then go, okay, I could have done this better. It helps you the next time do it
Yes.
better.
So it's that third person kind of self-awareness. I mean, we can't always change our behaviors in the middle of what's happening, but in reflection, recognizing, wait a second, it didn't go well. What should I do differently? And it is a practice. All of this is such a practice, and we have to keep showing up and doing the work and doing the practice. There's some good thoughts in the chat. We are a little bit over time. I want to be conscious of folks' time. So I just have one more slide for us in closing. And I, again, wanted to share from Kelly's sermon the other week. God's love shows up with us when we show up fighting for the beloved community of truth, justice, equality, and kindness that is God's love for us. God's love is that which triumphed over the crucifying violence of the cross. And so I know that it can certainly triumph over the hostility and enmity of our time. It is for this reason that in the end, Ephesians sums up the call to us as living in love. Ephesians says, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. With those words, I bid you good night. Thank you for coming, and let us go into the world living in love and sharing what we've learned. Passing out, we should just like pass out this book like candy, I think. There's so much good stuff in here. So thank you all for showing up tonight and for showing up to do this work. Blessings and good night. Peace be with you.
Good night.